If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more exclusive crypto content from CNBC, hit the subscribe button now. Global equity markets battered as the US bond yield curve inverts again for the third time in 2 weeks. Is a market meltdown imminent? And if so, is Bitcoin really a viable hedge? Bakkt finally sets a launch date as Bitcoin battles the $10,000 mark. Is there hope for alts, or is it time to finally bury them? Coinbase announces the purchase of strategic parts of Zappo and says that institutions are depositing between $200 and $400 million a week. If that's true, why aren't we seeing the numbers in the market, and are we really in a crypto bull market? Overstock CEO Patrick Byrne resigns after admitting that he's in the center of the Russian and Clinton investigations. What does this mean for T0 and for the broader Overstock blockchain plans? It's a big show tonight with two big names in crypto joining me right here in our New York City studio. This week's edition of Cryptotrader with Yoni Asya and Gabor Gorbaks starts right now.
Cryptotrader is proudly brought to you by eToro. Discover a simpler way to trade and invest in cryptocurrencies and more.
The US yield curve inverted once again on Thursday as the yield on the 10-year T-note traded under the yield of the 2-year. The third time this recessionary indicator has triggered in the last 2 weeks, leading some experts to suspect that a global meltdown may be looming. Let's cross over to San Francisco to speak to one such doomsday sayer. I've got Raz Gerber on the line. Raz, you're one of those people that say that the end of the world is coming. Tell us what you're thinking.
So we had 10 years of economic expansion that is the longest that we ever had. We have $250 trillion of debt around the world. And I believe the central banks are running out of options in their toolbox. And eventually we are going to see this meltdown. I'm not sure exactly when. So this could have only two options in my mind. Either we default on the debt, which means we also wipe up the assets, or we do it through inflation and debasement of the fiat currencies.
Now, guys, both of those sounds like bad options. One will cause the biggest global wipeout, one which we've never seen before, and the other basically means devaluing currencies and making everyone poorer.
Yes, there will be a wealth transfer over the next 10 years, which we haven't seen for a very long time, and I can't see any other way out.
Okay, now, what caused this? How did we get here?
So we had a quantitative ease that started roughly early 2009. Just to give you the numbers, so the Federal Reserve printed in 95 days the same amount of money they printed in 95 years before that. So from the foundation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 until 2009, the balance sheet was below $1 trillion. And in the next 95 days, it's doubled. And actually, we are now at around $4 trillion. Now, if you ask me, within the next 10 years, we are going to see the balance sheet of the Fed M1 probably hitting $8 to $10 trillion, while the baby boomers will start retiring and someone will have to buy these assets. So we are going to see something similar to what happened in Japan. Only Japan is probably 20 to 30 years ahead of the US in that regard.
Okay, guys, this doesn't sound like a very pretty picture. What can we do today to protect ourselves from what's about to happen?
So I'm not a financial advisor, but I can show you that since 2015, I've been talking with friends and family, telling them that Bitcoin could be a hedge. I'm not looking at Bitcoin as a speculation. I'm looking on it as a hedge. It is going to par with gold in terms of inflation within the next year or so. So in May 2020, we are going to have the halving, and the inflation of Bitcoin is going to par with gold, which is roughly a 1.7%. 4 years later, we are going to have the most scarce, the scarcest asset we ever had as human beings since gold, and it's going to be 0.9, 0.8% of inflation.
Raz, you're singing the same tune that every single crypto person in the world is singing right now, but it seems that we're the only ones singing. Why do you think that others and the institutions aren't following? Okay,
so if you look back to the 70s, we had a week ago, we had 48 years since Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard, which is known as the Nixon shock. Now, if you check the price of the gold, it didn't peak right immediately after the Nixon shock. It took a while until it will start to pick up. And basically, only 8 years later, it did like 16x on the US dollar. So it was $40 at the summer of 71, and it's $1,500 today. So do the math. So there was a devaluation of more than 95% of the US dollar versus gold. I believe that Nakamoto shock could be coming in the next couple of years. So it will take probably another 2 years until we will see the shock. So we will have an asset which is becoming more scarce as we move on the timeline, basically every 10 minutes. And if that happens, then this Nakamoto shock could be equivalent to the Nixon shock 50 years later.
That's Raz, and he's certainly got some very interesting views about an upcoming recession. Guys, what are we seeing here? Are we agreeing with him that this recession is imminent? Yoni, are we agreeing with him that there's a recession imminent? And is this inversion of the yield curve really such a doom sign?
I think I'll agree it's one possible scenario, right? So when you're investing, you're not investing on one scenario, you're investing on the probability of multiple scenarios. I think we all understand we've been in a very good markets, while shaky recently, generally trending upwards for the past 10 years. And everybody knows that market works in cycles. So everybody is a bit fearful of when this cycle ends and what happens when this cycle ends. Usually very good cycles end with very big crashes.
So we've had a very good cycle. It's been a 10-year-long good cycle. It's been exacerbated since Donald Trump came into power. That cycle's been accelerated. Are you then saying that we can expect a very strong down cycle after this?
I think, again, the physics of markets is booms and busts. We're in a boom cycle now. Busts are supposed to happen, whether it's next year or 3 to 5 years. I think the whole purpose of diversification is to prevent you in the long term getting hurt when busts happen. In the long term, stock markets are a very good investment. And in the long term, probably this speculative haven called Bitcoin probably also makes sense. It's a hedge against governments, and it's a hedge against a real catastrophe, where the real catastrophe is something that most people don't calculate, which is that transformation of wealth that Raz has been talking about. What happens if this really rallies while everything else crashes? People start buying Bitcoin, causing bank runs all around the world, right? That's something that nobody really calculates as real probability. But if that happens, then you better own 0.5% of your liquid assets in Bitcoin, 1%, people like around us maybe have more, but that's a very reasonable hedge against the catastrophe.
Gabor, is it a real assumption that people are going to put their money into Bitcoin when all hell breaks loose on global markets? Is it a real assumption outside of this bubble that we call crypto Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to tell. So I look at the gold markets often as a benchmark. There's $8 trillion in gold markets, and the world's managed portfolios hold about 0.6 to 0.7% of gold as a hedge against catastrophic scenarios and black swan events. And Bitcoin is a potential addition to that allocation sleeve. So gold is pushed to $8 trillion with that 0.7%. But again, this is also a sign of a very, like Yoni was talking about how a small amount of people actually really own Bitcoin right now. In the gold markets, which is around for a longest time, there's only 0.7%. So I think it's going to take some time. It's going to take some institutionalization, and people need to gain a little bit of confidence or more confidence in the markets. What I would say is different, between gold and Bitcoin is where we are sort of from a macroeconomic perspective. We've seen the yield curve inversion. There's $15 trillion of negative yielding bonds in the market. So pension funds and retirement portfolios are pushing money into negative returning assets. So what's an alternative to that? Well, Bitcoin and gold and some of these newly sort of like tokenized assets potentially. So diversification into those would make sense.
Do you think that this price run in Bitcoin was coincidental, that it came when the markets came down? Or do you think that it was because people were actually buying to get out of equity markets?
There's insufficient evidence for that generally. Right now, we've studied sort of Bitcoin and how it works, whether it works as a safe haven asset. And our studies concluded that about 30-40% of the time it behaves like gold. And then the other sort of like 60-70% of the time, depending on what you look at, it behaves like a tech stock. So Bitcoin is sort of, 30% safe haven and then 60-70% tech stock. So it will probably, we'll see Bitcoin shifting more towards the safe haven category as institutions will be getting more liquidity and ability to invest in this asset.
Yoni, you guys have big customers and you see the money flowing in. Did you see a correlation between the markets coming down, the equity markets coming down, and the Bitcoin investment in Bitcoin?
We definitely see a correlation between red days in the stock markets to green days in Bitcoin. And that correlates almost immediately to how customers react. So when we saw the rally from 3 to 6 and then 6 to 10, we saw immediately a rise in the number of new accounts coming to buy crypto. So people who maybe registered to eToro within the last 12 months, but then decided, I'm going to buy Bitcoin now. I'm going to buy ETH or XRP now. So we do see the rallies sort of supporting a lot of people to make the decision to buy now. And we actually are now seeing that settle down.
So I'm going to remind you guys that after the dot-com crash of 2001, we never saw another dot-com bull run. And Bitcoin has tripled again this year. And that to me is something that's unbelievable. Believe it or not, Bakkt is finally cleared to launch its physically settled Bitcoin futures contracts. Following a year of discussions with the New York regulators, the company finally obtained the New York State Trust Charter, paving the way for a September 23rd launch. Many crypto investors are anticipating that this launch could fuel Bitcoin buying. Yet despite this, Bitcoin is battling the $10,000 level while alts keep getting slaughtered. Tonight I have two big questions. Where are the Bitcoin buyers? And can we finally bury our alts? So Charlie, are alts dead? And can we finally bury them?
I think the 2017 and 2016 version of altcoins are a lesson to be learned. And that's the beauty of markets, is that we learn from them and they're constantly evolving. So I think we're going to see a whole new wave of alts, as we call them, right? Because they're alternative to Bitcoin. So you're going to see the next level of what are they? Different projects, different companies doing different things, but learning from the mistakes that we had in the past.
What about investors that invested in 2017 vintage of alts? Coins like ETH, EOS, Tron, and as you go down the list, there's a whole lot more. What happens to those investors?
You'll see, even using the term investor implies certain things. Were these people investing, but what are they investing in? In a company, in a token? When you invest in a token, what does that mean? So there were a lot of companies that didn't launch anything, didn't have a project that you can actually use this token. And those are going to have some problems, big problems. But where there's a project where you can actually use the token for something, then you'll get the value out of that.
Charlie, other than the exchange coins, the ones that are doing really well, are there any other projects that really use a token?
There are a few projects. I don't always like to name specific projects on TV because then their competitors will be like, why didn't you name us or whatever? So I kind of never do that.
Okay, so without referring to specific projects, are there any good use cases for tokens?
There are a lot fewer than I thought there would be here going into 2020. You would think that going into 2020 you'd have so many more, but a lot of projects didn't manage the money that they raised the right way. And a lot of them just simply ran out of money because they thought the bull market was going to continue going up. So they simply can't afford to build what they said they were going to build, unfortunately. It's a big problem.
Okay, so you speak about this new generation of tokens. What's the big difference between the old generation, the 2017 vintage, and the new generation of tokens?
I think a big difference will be that when these projects launch, they're not going to actually launch their tokens until there's an actual network built, a protocol built, a company, whatever their token is utilizing, then that's going to be built already. Let's think of it with software. Remember the old days when you'd buy like a video game, you'd have a serial key and you couldn't play the video game without the serial key. Now imagine if someone said, hey, I'll sell you this serial key, but the project is not actually, the game is not built yet. Why would you buy it? It doesn't make any sense.
Charlie, the big questions. If you are still holding alts from the 2017 bull run, would you hold them or sell them now and buy Bitcoin?
At this point, I would be either selling them if I had large amounts of those, but if you have a smaller amounts, like I have a few $1,000s of different projects that I just had from so long ago that I bought, I'm just kind of holding out and seeing if something happens down the road, because at this point it's not worth selling for 2,000 when if it goes to zero, whatever, but if it goes to 20,000, then at least I make something, you know?
Okay, so some really interesting thoughts. Yoni, I'm looking at you here. If you were holding coins from the 2017 vintage, would you be selling them now and buying Bitcoin, or would you hold on?
So I do hold some bags, and I keep on holding them. So I'm not going to the market selling them. I think generally the concept of utility token still makes sense to me. I think there was irrational exuberance in the altcoin market.
Oh, you think?
I think, definitely. And I think it makes sense that to some extent we saw a very significant correction. I think it's very clear Bitcoin is king. And with 70%...
So Bitcoin is king. What about ETH? $20 billion market valuation.
So first of all, I think like the concept of the hashtag Ether postmortem is a bit exaggerated. It's still a very big community. It's still a very big developer ecosystem. People are still building stuff on it, and it's still valued at $20 billion, which is a big number, 20 billion. There are still other 14 alts or 13 alts trading at over $1 billion. That's still relatively impressive. I think everybody's a bit disappointed that we haven't seen any killer app until now, that we haven't seen anything really take off as usage either on ETH or on the Ethereum network or on others.
Except exchange coins. Except the Binance coins, the KuCoins, and all those coins.
Well, without getting into specifics, I think in general using a token as a way to sort of rev share, profit share, hold any type of, that is the premise also of the entire discussion around security tokens. So I think that generally makes sense from the point of view, eToro has shareholders, they have shares. If I can tokenize that and enable them to transfer it more easily, it's just a nice, cool feature for shares. Should it be done on the blockchain? Yes, if I wanted it to get listed on a lot of different exchanges.
That's another discussion which we are going to have later in the show. Are you holding any bags of shitcoins?
Well, I'm a Bitcoiner, and I sort of don't want to discuss my holdings publicly, and I don't actually recommend people to buy any of these alts. A lot of people in the markets actually don't hold any digital assets, so I think Bitcoin is a good place to start. And the analogy that I like to bring up is that a lot of these tokens represent protocols, such as the TCP/IP kind of protocol, which sort of was the backbone of the internet. So I would encourage people to focus on building on top layers of Bitcoin and consider sort of like a plan B, and and go and build on a second layer and figure out that type of ecosystem. That's really missing.
So you're a Bitcoin bull through and through. Does that mean that we're not going to get an ETH ETF or an ETF of a whole lot of shitcoins wrapped up?
Well, we jokingly, we have created an index, MVDASC, which is the MVIS digital asset small cap, so at small cap index. It's also called sometimes the shitcoin index.
And that's trading at zero.
It's trading down, but it's a good way to monitor the market. So there's actually multiple market capitalization ranges, and I actually, I'm a Bitcoiner. It's okay to experiment. It's great that some people have experimented with tokens. But I think for those who have not succeeded, I would basically encourage them to experiment more, but think about higher layers. Like, what do we build on top of these things, and not just build 2,000 competing protocols. The internet has probably one functioning and 3 alternative protocols, and all
It wasn't like that when the internet started.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, there was a race for protocols, and TCP/IP was the one that got the biggest network effect.
Yeah.
Anyway, after the break, we're going to be talking to Gabor about institutional interest, and we are going to be grilling him around when the Bitcoin ETF is coming. So stay tuned. Coinbase announced last week that they've bought parts of Hong Kong-based wallet and custodian provider Zappo. The announcement brings their total assets under management to over $7 billion, making them the biggest custodian player in the industry. At the same time, Brian Armstrong said that they're seeing between $200 and $400 million of weekly institutional inflows. If this is indeed the case, why are the markets not moving? Many traders are asking the question whether we're in a bull market or a bear market. And I'm asking the question whether we're getting a Bitcoin ETF that can finally bring the institutions into crypto.
I think it's the regulator's best option to eventually approve a Bitcoin ETF, and right now, retail investors do have access to the market, but the institutions don't. In the foreseeable future, I think institutions should get access to this market, and can't talk about the specifics of any applications.
So I'm not going to ask you about specifics, but I am going to put you a little bit on the spot here. Your whole day, every day, all day, is dedicated to creating a Bitcoin ETF. That's your role?
It's part of it. We experiment with a number of things, and that hopefully you guys will see
he
soon.
Spends all his day on Twitter.
I've seen that, yes. So with that in mind, spending majority of your time on this, and you've been doing this for a long time, given the fact that we had this delay and then you had to unfile and refile, are you not personally getting a little bit despondent?
Well, I'm disappointed that logically a Bitcoin ETF makes sense. Everyone wants to protect investors. Everyone wants more liquidity. Everyone wants institutions to come into the market. And I think we've put together the perfect product with the right index, the right sort of custody, the right insurance, and it's just sort of caught up in regulatory red tape. I still do think that an institutional version of an ETF has a very good chance to come to market, and I'm excited about that.
Are you making progress behind the scenes with the SEC that we're not all seeing?
Yeah, we are making progress, and it's actually the work is grueling behind the scenes, and we had to build indices. We had to go through hundreds of pages of structuring documents and come up with solutions that didn't exist at the time. And Bakkt, we've talked about this, has announced that they're going to launch, so that there's going to be physical connection to the futures market. There's correct pricing indices from our subsidiary. There's exchanges are cleaning up a little bit finally. So I have hope. The Bitcoin markets are actually more transparent than many of the FX markets and
more transparent than oil, and more transparent than all the other commodities.
Yeah.
I mean, there's manipulation in all those markets.
Is it public who's the custody of your future ETF?
It is. So it is our sort of storage as in the S1 filing that we have submitted.
So your own solution?
Yeah, we have our own solution. The differentiation actually is very interesting. So we have a level of insurance on top of it based on the safekeeping methodology, which is, as we have seen in the crypto markets, exchanges disappear, hacks happen. So insurance is one of those things that we took very seriously with the Solidex and Vanek team.
Yoni, $55 million is apparently the price tag that Coinbase paid for parts of this business. And I think the biggest part of the business was the custodian part of the business. Why do you think Zappo sold this?
I haven't talked to either sides, so I'm not sure. But, from what we heard, the majority of the custody business was given for free. I believe that Zappo wants to focus on their consumers and on their B2C play. So I think both parties thought that one party would focus more on institutionals and the other would focus more on their consumer play.
Do you think the market is ready for a Bitcoin ETF? Do you think that the SEC, the US regulator, is ready for a Bitcoin ETF?
I think that it's going to take time to see a consumer retail ETF. Because I think the SEC concerns around consumer protection and how the current Bitcoin markets and transparency are not fully aligned. But again, doesn't mean necessarily it won't happen. It just means that I think it's going to take longer. But he's really the expert on that. And I think on a consumer level also, I'm not 100% sure I think a Bitcoin ETF is that important. I mean, consumers today in the US can download an eToro app and buy Bitcoin.
We're not worried about
They can do it with other apps.
We want institutions. We need institutions.
But there's a very big difference. Remember, I think a lot of the Bitcoin ETF issues was around consumer protection. If you're thinking about institutional grade products that track the price of Bitcoin, I think that should have an easier path than the retail part. The retail part, I think, already have access to Bitcoin, which is actually relatively easier and smarter.
Anyone can buy Bitcoin anytime. It's the simplest thing in the world.
Yeah, so
log on to eToro, our sponsors, and you can do that.
Yeah.
Gabor, when is the next SEC deadline? By when are you expecting to get some kind of finality?
I think this fall we're going to see some action in the space. It's October, mid-October. That's the final deadline. That's sort of a yes or no deadline. But we've made significant progress, and we're not giving it up on the space. So
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Until then you can go to eToro and Neu-Ner's exchange, and then for the retail side, and I think institutions will get get an access vehicle hopefully soon.
Well, on that note, we're going to let you go, and we're going to bring in someone from T0 after the resignation of Patrick Byrne yesterday from Overstock. Stay tuned after the break. It's a big story. The eccentric T0 CEO, or Overstock CEO, has resigned, and we'll find out what that means for Overstock's blockchain plans. Patrick Byrne, the eccentric Overstock CEO, has tendered his resignation. Just 10 days after his controversial interview on Fox News, where he admitted that he had landed up in the center of the Russia and Clinton investigation. Now, with me in the studio, I've got Sam Noseli, who's the CEO of T0. Sam, what does this mean for Overstock's bigger blockchain plans? I know that Patrick was the guy driving the blockchain strategy. I know the board didn't always agree to go into blockchain, and now Patrick is gone.
Yeah. It's very sad news. I hate seeing him go. He's the founder, and he created the entire culture of Overstock and these portfolio companies. But that said, Jonathan Johnson is stepping in as interim CEO, as was announced, and he's the chair of T0 and been president of Medici Ventures. So he's a huge advocate for blockchain in general, and specifically T0, which he describes as the crown jewel of Medici.
What's been the holdup? Has it been the regulators that have been keeping the flow so slow when it comes to security tokens?
Because I think security tokens.
Yeah, because I think we all agree that it's been a bit disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was what happened with ICOs, I think, and the crackdown that happened there, and I think rightfully so. And so now we're doing it a legitimate way. The regulators are working with us, but it's very incremental in how it moves forward. And we're also, T0 itself, we have a pipeline of about 200 companies that want to do, but we're being very selective. So about 5 to 10% of those we feel are legitimate quality assets that we want to issue, and so we're working with those.
But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. I'll be back again next week. Until then, I'll be on Twitter at CryptoManRun, and you should trade well, my friends.
Cryptotrader is proudly brought to you by eToro. Discover a simpler way to trade and invest in cryptocurrencies and more.